I spent the last 2 years of seminary attending the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco as my spiritual home. This decision was for many reasons, but mostly because I had grown fond of some specific people in that community, in particular, my advisor at the Pacific School of Religion, Reverend Dr. Dorsey Blake. My affiliation with Dr. Blake had been a bit accidental, coming largely as a result of my primary advisor, Reverend Dr. Odette Lockwood Stewart, going on sabbatical during my first full year at PSR. But this was a happy accident. Odette knew what I wanted in an advisor from our conversations and was spot on in asking Dorsey to pinch hit. I received many gifts from Dorsey's advisorship, and I still receive his gifts. But above all, I think having an intimate introduction to the work and world of Howard Thurman will stay with me for the rest of my life and the rest of my ministry. As it would happen, Dorsey Blake, who was close with Dr. Thurman's wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, is the lead co-minister at Fellowship Church, and he continues Dr. Thurman's mission to this day, building and sustaining an intentionally multiracial, multicultural, and multi-religious community. It's a place where I've heard and received some of the best ministry. The thrilling preaching of Reverend Elena Rose, the insight and brave advocacy of Reverend Susie Spangenberg, and the wisdom and compassion of Reverend Catherine Benton, his co-lead minister. I was thrilled also by the creativity and full embrace of the music offered by Dr. Carl Blake, who will always be one of the best accompanists I have ever worked with. It's a small community, but it is wildly diverse. I think, however, what I love about its diversity is that it is not diverse for diversity's sake, but because the people know each other. They care about each other and authentically support one another's lives, growth, and passions. They are in active and intentional relationship with each other. It is the living, beloved community. This was always Howard Thurman's goal, however. When fellowship was started in the mid-1940s, there was no such thing as an intentionally integrated multi-faith church in the United States. Social segregation was the law in more than half of the country, and it was the assumption in the rest. Above all, religion was segregated everywhere you went. I can attest to this through my own family, where my grandfather, who served churches in both the South and the North, Charleston, South Carolina, and then Brooklyn and Queens in New York, only had all-black congregations until the very end of his more than 40-year ministry in the mid-1960s. My mother's childhood church, the historic Siloam Presbyterian in Brooklyn, served by the Reverend Milton Galamison, was very much a black Presbyterian church. The experiment of Fellowship Church, coming when it did on the heels of World War II, was right on time. As the horrors of the Nazi racial and religious persecution of Jewish people became known, the United States' own persecution of people, and specifically anti-black policies, were put in a very different light. Thurman, who had been brought up in the depths of the legally segregated South, had been on an incredible journey of discovery through his own formation. Born in Daytona Beach, Florida, he studied at Morehouse College. He then went on to seminary in Rochester, New York, being exposed to the experience of being one of only 2 blacks in the program. Upon his graduation, he returned to Morehouse, but then eventually secured a professorship at Howard University as the first dean of the Rankin Memorial Chapel, the first black man to be so honored in this country. Most importantly, however, it was his travels to India during the 1930s that would prove the greatest influence on his life and legacy. In India, Thurman was exposed to the work around nonviolence that was at the heart of Gandhi's movement of resistance against British colonial rule. During his travels, he was also challenged by Indian scholars about the position of blacks in the United States, and who insisted that the United States was hypocritical in pointing any judgment at India particularly from a missionary standpoint. Thurman and his wife's meetings with Gandhi were pivotal to him bringing back with him the ideas of nonviolence and cultural empowerment that would become the foundation for what he taught and what his students, like Martin Luther King Jr., would receive from him when he was on the faculty of Boston University starting in the early 1950s. Howard Thurman wrote many volumes of work, and I will include a few links to some important pieces that I used to create this message today. Throughout all of his work, early and late, he is passionate about the interconnectedness of human beings. His embrace of nonviolence is one expression of this, as is his connection to mysticism. Throughout his writing, he is consistent in calling for an integrated world that isn't integrated for integration's sake, but that asks us to look at the question of integration as an outgrowth of our relationships. It is not just racial integration, but cultural and relational integration. In many ways, it is the act of desegregation and integration as acts of nonviolence that I find most resonant in his work. In his essential book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman wrote, "American Christianity has betrayed the religion of Jesus almost beyond redemption. Churches have been established for the underprivileged, the weak, the poor, on the theory they prefer to be among themselves. Churches have been established for the Chinese, the Japanese, the Korean, the Mexican, the Filipino, the Italian, and the Negro with the same theory in mind. The result is that in the one place in which normal, free contacts might be most naturally established, in which the relations of the individual to his God should take priority over conditions of class, race, power, status, wealth, or the like, this place is one of the chief instruments for guaranteeing barriers." It is clear that working as part of the team that brought together the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, alongside co-pastor Alfred Fisk, a white Presbyterian pastor, Howard Thurman created a living manifestation of the vision that he believed would counteract this primary failing in American Christianity. The learning from Fellowship Church was rich and offers a real lesson in what I called earlier the living beloved community. You may find some of the language he uses to describe what he's worked toward familiar. In his 1966 essay, Desegregation, Integration, and the Beloved Community, Dr. Thurman explains, "During the years when the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco was being developed, it became increasingly clear that the mere presence of people of different ethnic or cultural backgrounds in the membership did not mean that the church itself was integrated. The coming together of people in such institutions must be rooted in natural communal association. They must be able to participate meaningfully in the various phases of their living if their relationship in more formal ways is to be positive and creative. Meaningful experiences of integration between peoples are more compelling than the fears, the inhibitions, the dogmas, or the prejudices that divide. If such unifying experiences can be multiplied over an extended time interval, they will be able to restructure the entire fabric of the social context." As Unitarian Universalists, we talk about multiculturalism and anti-racism. We talk about them as goals, as arrival points. But we are often lost when it comes to the process. How do we get there? How do we get to the beloved community? In his words, Thurman literally tells us, if unifying experiences can be multiplied over an extended time interval, they will be able to restructure the entire fabric of the social context. We talk about it, We want it. We have people of great brilliance who have told us how to get there. We have living examples of how these methods can succeed. So why don't we do it? I believe we don't do it because there is not a critical mass willing to do the actual hard labor that is required. The labor, in many ways, is less about dismantling white supremacy and more about dismantling the ways in which people have learned to live and feel safe in the context of not just white supremacy, but also capitalism, individualism, privacy, and privilege. Several years ago, I developed a tool that may be useful here. It's a questionnaire designed to help people in a workshop setting ask what their world looks like. It can be used for any identity, really, but it has been particularly useful when asking people to assess their world from a racial perspective. When I've used this line of questioning for groups of white people engaging anti-racism, the question becomes quite simply, how white is your world? Here are just a few of the questions in the context of racial difference. 1. How often do you interact with people who you identify as different from your race? 2. In what context or contexts do you interact with people who identify different from you racially? 3. When was your last conversation with someone who you identify as being different than you racially? 4. How would you characterize most of your interactions with people who identify different from you racially? Is it transactional, personal, educational, entertainment, service-related, etc.? And 5. How many people who you identify as a different race from yours can you name quickly? And now try answering those questions without including me as part of your answers. Howard Thurman left us a legacy of inquiry, writing, insight, and thought that is still alive. It came through in the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., and it even shows up in some of our beloved Reverend Thomas Michelson's work. Thurman touches us. But beyond his papers and lectures, beyond his appointments and resume, he left us with the living, beloved community in the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. I am so blessed to have been given just one of the seeds of this community to carry out into the world, and I hope First Parish in Cambridge and anyone engaging this message today will receive its potential with an open and eager heart. It is with this spirit that we can change the world. If unifying experiences can be multiplied over an extended time interval, they will be able to restructure the entire fabric of the social context. Go in peace.